Martin Heidegger, the 20th-century German philosopher, produced a large body of work that intended a profound change of direction for philosophy. Such was the depth of change that he found it necessary to introduce a large number of neologisms, often connected to idiomatic words and phrases in the German language. Two of his most basic neologisms, present at hand and ready to hand, are used to describe various attitudes towards things in the world. For Heidegger, such attitudes are prior to, i.e., more basic than, the various sciences of the individual items in the world. Science itself is an attitude, one that attempts a kind of neutral investigation. Other related terms are also explained below. Heidegger's overall analysis is quite involved, taking in a lot of the history of philosophy. See Being and Time for a description of his overall project. And to give some context to these technical terms. Aletheia, Ancient Greek, lambda eta theta epsilon iota alpha. Heidegger's idea of aletheia, or disclosure, Erschlossenheit, was an attempt to make sense of how things in the world appear to human beings as part of an opening in intelligibility, as unclosedness, or unconcealedness. This is Heidegger's usual reading of aletheia as Unverborgenheit, unconcealment. Quote, "It is closely related to the notion of world disclosure. The way in which things get their sense is part of a holistically structured, pre-interpreted background of meaning." Initially, Heidegger wanted aletheia to stand for a reinterpreted definition of truth. However, he later corrected the association of aletheia with truth. See main article on aletheia for more information. Apophantic, an assertion, as opposed to a question, a doubt or a more expressive sense, is apophantic. It is a statement that covers up meaning and just gives us something as present at hand. For instance, the president is on vacation, and salt is sodium chloride, are sentences that, because of their apophantic character, can easily be picked up and repeated in news and gossip by the they. However, the real ready-to-hand meaning and context may be lost. Being in the world, German, in der Welt sein. Being in the world is Heidegger's replacement for terms such as subject, object, consciousness, and world. For him, the split of things into subject, object, as we find in the Western tradition and even in our language, must be overcome, as is indicated by the root structure of Husserl and Brentano's concept of intentionality, i.e., that all consciousness is consciousness of something, that there is no consciousness, as such, cut off from an object, be it the matter of a thought or of a perception, nor are there objects without some consciousness beholding a being involved with them. At the most basic level of being in the world, Heidegger notes that there is always a mood that assails us in our unreflecting devotion to the world. A mood comes neither from the outside, nor from the inside, but arises from being in the world. One may turn away from a mood, but that is only to another mood. It is part of our facticity. Only with a mood are we permitted to encounter things in the world. Dasein, a co-term for being in the world, has an openness to the world that is constituted by the attunement of a mood, a state of mind. As such, Dasein is a thrown projection, Entwurf, projecting itself onto the possibilities that lie before it or may be hidden, and interpreting and understanding the world in terms of possibilities. Such projecting has nothing to do with comporting oneself toward a plan that has been thought out. It is not a plan, since Dasein has, as Dasein, already projected itself. Dasein always understands itself in terms of possibilities. As projecting, the understanding of Dasein is its possibilities as possibilities. One can take up the possibilities of the they self and merely follow along and make some more authentic understanding. See Hubert Dreyfus's book Being in the World, Being Toward Death. German, Sehnsucht. Being toward death is not an orientation that brings Dasein closer to its end, in terms of clinical death, but is rather a way of being. Heideggerian terminology refers to a process of growing through the world where a certain foresight guides the Dasein towards gaining an authentic perspective. It is provided by dread of death. In the analysis of time, it is revealed as a threefold condition of being: time, the present, and the notion of the eternal are modes of temporality. Temporality is the way we see time. For Heidegger, it is very different from the mistaken view of time as being a linear series of past, present and future. Instead, he sees it as being an ecstasy, an outside of itself, of future projections, possibilities, and one's place in history as a part of one's generation. Possibilities, then, are integral to our understanding of time. Our projects, or thrown projection in the world, are what absorb and direct us. Futurity, as a direction toward the future that always contains the past, the has-been, is a primary mode of Dasein's temporality. Death is that possibility which is the absolute impossibility of Dasein. As such, it cannot be compared to any other kind of ending or running out of something. For example, one's death is not an empirical event. For Heidegger, death is Dasein's own most. It is what makes Dasein individual. It is non-relational. Nobody can take one's death away from one, or die in one's place. And we cannot understand our own death through the death of other Dasein. And it is not to be outstripped. The not yet of life is always already a part of Dasein. As soon as man comes to life, he is at once old enough to die. The threefold condition of death is thus simultaneously one's own most potentiality for being, non-relational, and not to be outstripped. Death is determinate in its inevitability. But an authentic being toward death understands the indeterminate nature of one's own inevitable death. One never knows when or how it is going to come. However, this indeterminacy does not put death in some distant, futural, not yet. Authentic being toward death understands one's individual death as always already a part of one. With average, everyday, normal discussion of death, all this is concealed. The they self talks about it in a fugitive manner, passes it off as something that occurs at some time but is not yet present at hand as an actuality, and hides its character as one's own most possibility, presenting it as belonging to no one in particular. It becomes devalued, redefined as a neutral and mundane aspect of existence that merits no authentic consideration. One dies is interpreted as a fact, and comes to mean nobody dies. On the other hand, authenticity takes Dasein out of the they, in part by revealing its place as a part of the they. Heidegger states that authentic being toward death calls Dasein's individual self out of its they self, and frees it to re-evaluate life from the standpoint of finitude. In so doing, Dasein opens itself up for Angst, translated alternately as dread or as anxiety. Angst, as opposed to fear, does not have any distinct object for its dread. It is rather anxious in the face of being in the world in general. That is, it is anxious in the face of Dasein's own self. Angst is a shocking individuation of Dasein, when it realizes that it is not at home in the world, or when it comes face to face with its own uncanny German unheimlich, not at home. In Dasein's individuation, it is open to hearing the call of conscience, German Gewissensruf, which comes from Dasein's own self when it wants to be itself. This self is then open to truth, understood as unconcealment, Greek aletheia. In this moment of vision, Dasein understands what is hidden as well as hiddenness itself, indicating Heidegger's regular uniting of opposites. In this case, truth and untruth, being with German Mitsein, The term being refers to an ontological characteristic of the human being, that it is always already with others of its kind. This assertion is to be understood not as a factual statement about an individual, that he or she is at the moment in spatial proximity to one or more other individuals. Rather, it is a statement about the being of every human, that in the structures of its being in the world one finds an implicit reference to other humans. We all live with others, and in fact we could not live without them. Humans have been called, by others, not by Heidegger, ultrasocial, and obligatorily gregarious. Without others of our kind we could not survive. Heidegger, from his phenomenological perspective, calls this feature of human life being with Mitsane, and says it is essential to being human. We are inauthentic when we fail to recognize how much and in what ways how we think of ourselves, and how we habitually behave is influenced by our social surroundings. We are authentic when we pay attention to that influence and decide for ourselves whether to go along with it or not. Living entirely without such influence, however, is not an option. Care or concern. German. Sorge. A fundamental basis of our being in the world is, for Heidegger, not matter or spirit but care. Dasein's facticity is such that its being in the world has always dispersed itself or even split itself up into definite ways of being in. The multiplicity of these is indicated by the following examples: having to do with something, producing something, attending to something and looking after it, making use of something, giving something up and letting it go, undertaking, accomplishing, evincing, interrogating, considering, discussing, determining. All these ways of being in have concern, sorge, care, as their kind of being. Just as the scientist might investigate a search and presume neutrality, we see that beneath this there is the mood, the concern of the scientist to discover, to reveal new ideas or theories and to attempt to level off temporal aspects. Clearing. German. Lichtung. In German the word Lichtung means a clearing, as in, for example, a clearing in the woods. Since its root is the German word for light, Licht, it is sometimes also translated as lighting. And in Heidegger's work it refers to the necessity of a clearing in which anything at all can appear, the clearing in which something or idea can show itself, or be unconcealed. Note the relation that this has to aletheia. See the main article of the entry above. And disclosure. Being, but not beings, stands out as if in a clearing, or physically, as if in a space. Thus, Hubert Dreyfus writes, things show up in the light of our understanding of being. Quote, destruction. Here is Martin Heidegger on philosophy as the task of destroying ontological concepts. In other words, also including ordinary everyday meanings of words like time, history, being, theory, death, mind, body, matter, logic, etc. When tradition thus becomes master, it does so in such a way that what it transmits is made so inaccessible, proximally and for the most part, that it rather becomes concealed. Tradition takes what has come down to us and delivers it over to self-evidence. It blocks our access to those primordial sources from which the categories and concepts handed down to us have been in part quite genuinely drawn. Indeed, it makes us forget that they have had such an origin, and makes us suppose that the necessity of going back to these sources is something which we need not even understand. Being in time. p. 43. Heidegger considers that tradition can become calcified here and there. If the question of being is to have its own history made transparent, then this hardened tradition must be loosened up, and the concealments which it has brought about dissolved. We understand this task as one in which, by taking the question of being as our clue, we are to destroy the traditional content of ancient ontology until we arrive at those primordial experiences in which we achieved our first ways of determining the nature of being, the ways which have guided us ever since. Being and Time. p. 44. Heidegger then remarks on the positivity of his project of destruction. It has nothing to do with a vicious relativizing of ontological standpoints. But this destruction is just as far from having the negative sense of shaking off the ontological tradition. We must, on the contrary, stake out the positive possibilities of the tradition. And this means keeping it within its limits. And these in turn are given factically in the way the question is formulated at the time, and in the way the possible field for investigation is thus bounded off. On its negative side, this destruction does not relate itself toward the past. Its criticism is aimed at today, and at the prevalent way of treating the history of ontology. But to bury the past in nullity, nixigate, is not the purpose of this destruction. Its aim is positive. Its negative function remains unexpressed and indirect. Being and Time. p. 44. Dasein. Dasein is a German word and is sometimes translated as being there or being here. Da combines in its meaning here and there, excluding the spatial relational distinction made by the English words. Sein is the infinitive, to be. It is the German form of the existential expletive, which, as in most European languages, is expressed idiomatically. Heidegger, after Nietzsche, used the word but as a gerund synonym for human being or human entity. A Dasein is then a new coinage for a being that is there, in a familiar world, and in a mood. Dasein also has unique capacities for language, intersubjective communication, and detached reasoning. Heidegger does not want to get tied up with overused and ambiguous words such as person, consciousness, soul, or spirit. So Dasein is a new way of approaching something all of those other words point towards, but without the connotations. Dasein is the starting point of Heidegger's ontology. It is typically thought to apply to humans, but it could apply to any being that fulfills the definition's characteristics which he states. What makes a being a Dasein is as follows. Dasein is a being whose being is an issue for itself. Every Dasein has an a priori sense of mindness, or being oneself. Dasein is always thrown into the world, meaning it finds itself within a world, meaning no Dasein has ever been decontextualized. We are all world-bound, submerged, entangled, and engaged with our ontological surroundings through care, concern, and moods. Dasein has various modes of being in the world, which are the subject of much of Heidegger's analysis in Being and Time. Furthermore, average humans have a pre-ontological, general intuitive sense of being, understanding of being insofar as they understand what things are and that they are e.g., my dog is brown, or today is Sunday. Heidegger believed that this pre-reflective understanding of being, that which determines entities as entities, helps constitute our unique existence as human beings. Thus the coinage of Dasein, quote, disclosure, or world disclosure, German, Erschlossenheit. Hubert Dreyfus and Charles Spinoza write that, according to Heidegger, our nature is to be world disclosers. That is, by means of our equipment in coordinated practices we human beings open coherent, distinct contexts or worlds in which we perceive, feel, act, and think. Quote, Heidegger scholar Nicholas Compridis writes, world disclosure refers, with deliberate ambiguity, to a process which actually occurs at two different levels. At one level, it refers to the disclosure of an already interpreted, symbolically structured world, the world, that is, within which we always already find ourselves. At another level, it refers as much to the disclosure of new horizons of meaning as to the disclosure of previously hidden or unthematized dimensions of meaning. Quote, discourse, German. Read. The ontological existential structure of Dasein consists of thrownness, Geworfenheit, projection, Entwurf, and being, along with engagement, Saint Bei. These three basic features of existence are inseparably bound to discourse. Read. Understood as the deepest unfolding of language. Equipment. German. Das Zeug. An object in the world with which we have meaningful dealings. A nearly untranslatable term. Heidegger's equipment can be thought of as a collective noun, so that it is never appropriate to call something an equipment. Instead, its use often reflects it to mean a tool, or as an, in order to, for Dasein. Tools, in this collective sense, and in being ready to hand, always exist in a network of other tools and organizations. E.g., the paper is on a desk in a room at a university. It is inappropriate usually to see such equipment on its own or as something present at hand. Erroneous. Erroneous is translated often as an event, but is better understood in terms of something coming into view. It comes from the German prefix comparable to re in English, and oj, I. It is a noun coming from a reflexive verb. Note that the German prefix also can connote an end or a fatality. A recent translation of the word by Kenneth Maley in Parversi MAD renders the word as enowning, that in connection with things that arise and appear, that they are arising into their own. Hubert Dreyfus defined the term as things coming into themselves by belonging together. Quote, erroneous appears in Heidegger's later works and is not easily summarized. The most sustained treatment of the theme occurs in the cryptic and difficult contributions to philosophy. In the following quotation, he associates it with the fundamental idea of concern from being and time. The English etymology of concern is similar to that of the German. We must return to what we call a concern. The word erroneous, concern, has been lifted from organically developing language. Erinnern, to concern, means, originally, to distinguish or discern which one's eyes see, and in seeing calling to oneself. Appropriate. The word concern we shall now harness as a theme word in the service of thought. Existence. Heidegger uses this word to describe the nature of Dasein's being. Beings unlike Dasein, chairs, shoes, etc., do not exist. They are merely objectively present. Dasein exists. Chairs are objectively present. Two related words, existenziell and existential, are used as descriptive characteristics of being. To be existenziell is a categorical or onto-characteristic, an understanding of all this which relates to one's existence, while an existenziell is an ontological characteristic, the structure of existence. Gelassenheit, often translated as releasement. Heidegger's concept of Gelassenheit has been explained as the spirit of disponibility, availability, before what is, which permits us simply to let things be in whatever may be their uncertainty and their mystery. Heidegger elaborated the idea of Gelassenheit in 1959, with a homonymous volume which includes two texts. A 1955 talk entitled simply Gelassenheit, and a conversation, Gespräch, entitled Zur Erörterung der Gelassenheit, aus einem Feldweggespräch über das Denken, towards an explication of Gelassenheit, from a conversation on a country path about thinking, or toward an emplacing discussion, Erörterung, of releasement, Gelassenheit, from a country path conversation about thinking. An English translation of this text was published in 1966 as Conversation on a Country Path About Thinking. He borrowed the term from the Christian mystical tradition, approximately from Meister Eckhart. Geworfenheit. Geworfenheit describes our individual existences as being thrown, geworfen, into the world. For William J. Richardson, Heidegger used this single term, thrownness. 2. Describe the two elements of the original situation: the being's non-mastery of its own origin and its referential dependence on other beings. Care. Heidegger's later works, beginning by 1930 and largely established by the early 1940s, seem to many commentators, e.g. William J. Richardson, to at least reflect a shift of focus, if not indeed a major change in his philosophical thinking, which is known as the turn die. One way this has been understood is as a shift from doing to dwelling, and from being and time to time and being. However, others feel that this is to overstate the difference. Heidegger himself held between 1 and 4 December 1949 at Bremen Club 4 lectures, which were repeated in the spring of 1950, 25 and 26 March, unchanged at below.Heidegger. The titles were Das Ding, Das Gestel, Die Gefahr and Die Kehre. The third lecture is still unpublished, while the other 3 lectures, again unchanged, were collected in a book entitled Die Technik und Die Kehre and published in 1962. According to different sources, Die Technik und Die Kehre includes the 2 lectures Die Frage nach der Technik und Die Kehre. Ontic. Heidegger uses the term ontic, often in contrast to the term ontological, when he gives descriptive characteristics of a particular thing and the plain facts of its existence. What is ontic is what makes something what it is. For an individual discussing the nature of being, one's ontic could refer to the physical, factual elements that produce and/or underlie one's own reality, the physical brain and its substructures. Moralists raise the question of a moral ontic when discussing whether there exists an external, objective, independent source or wellspring for morality that transcends culture and time. Ontological. German. Ontologisch, as opposed to ontic. Ontisch. Ontological is used when the nature or meaningful structure of existence is at issue. Ontology, our discipline of philosophy, focuses on the formal study of being. Thus, something that is ontological is concerned with understanding and investigating being, the ground of being, or the concept of being itself. For an individual discussing the nature of being, the ontological could refer to one's own first-person, subjective, phenomenological experience of being. By way of comparison, Harold Atmanspacher referred to the distinction between 3 perspectives when considering a system. 1. The ontology of one's own experience with that system. 2. One's own knowledge of the states and observables of the system, epistemic perspective. And 3. The states and observables of the system, independent of one's own knowledge, ontic perspective. Possibility. German. Möglichkeit, a term used only once in a particular edition of Being and Time. In the text, the term appears to denote the possibility whose probability it is solely to be possible, at least, if it were used in context. This is the only plausible definition present at hand. German. Vorhanden. Vorhandenheit, presence at hand. With the present at hand one has, in contrast to ready to hand, an attitude like that of a scientist or theorist, of merely looking at or observing something. In seeing an entity as present at hand, the beholder is concerned only with the bare facts of a thing or a concept, as they are present, and in order to theorize about it. This way of seeing is disinterested in the concern it may hold for Dasein, its history or usefulness. This attitude is often described as existing in neutral space without any particular mood or subjectivity. However, for Heidegger, it is not completely disinterested or neutral. It has a mood, and is part of the metaphysics of presence that tends to level all things down. Through his writings, Heidegger sets out to accomplish the destruction, see above, of this metaphysics of presence. Present at hand is not the way things in the world are usually encountered, and it is only revealed as a deficient or secondary mode. E.g., when a hammer breaks it loses its usefulness and appears as merely there, present at hand. When a thing is revealed as present at hand, it stands apart from any useful set of equipment but soon loses this mode of being present at hand, and becomes something, for example, that which must be repaired or replaced. Ready to hand. German Griffbereit, Zuhandenheit, readiness to hand, handiness. However, in almost all cases we are involved in the world in an ordinary, and more involved, way. We are usually doing things with a view to achieving something. Take for example, a hammer. It is ready to hand. We use it without theorizing. In fact, if we were to look at it as present at hand, we might easily make a mistake. Only when it breaks or something goes wrong might we see the hammer as present at hand, just lying there. Even then, however, it may be not fully present at hand, as it is now showing itself as something to be repaired or disposed, and therefore a part of the totality of our involvements. In this case its being may be seen as unreadiness to hand. Heidegger outlines three manners of unreadiness to hand: conspicuous, damaged, e.g., a lamp's wiring has broken; obtrusive, a part is missing which is required for the entity to function, e.g., we find the bulb is missing; obstinate, when the entity is a hindrance to us in pursuing a project, e.g., the lamp blocks my view of the computer screen. Importantly, the present at hand only emerges from the prior attitude in which we care about what is going on, and we see the hammer in a context, a world of equipment that is handy or remote, and that is there in order to do something. In this sense, the ready to hand is primordial compared to that of the present at hand. The term primordial here does not imply something primitive, but rather refers to Heidegger's idea that being can only be understood through what is everyday and close to us. Our everyday understanding of the world is necessarily essentially a part of any kind of scientific or theoretical studies of entities. The present at hand might be only by studying our average everyday understanding of the world, as it is expressed in the totality of our relationships to the ready-to-hand entities of the world, can we lay appropriate basis for specific scientific investigations into specific entities within the world. For Heidegger in Being and Time, this illustrates, in a very practical way, the way the present at hand, as a present in a now, or a present eternally, as, for example, a scientific law or a Platonic form, has come to dominate intellectual thought, especially since the Enlightenment. To understand the question of being, one must be careful not to fall into this leveling off, or forgetfulness of being, that has come to assail Western thought since Socrates. See the metaphysics of presence. Resoluteness. German. Entschlossenheit. Resoluteness refers to one's ability to unclose one's framework of intelligibility, i.e., to make sense of one's words and actions in terms of one's life as a whole, and the ability to be receptive to the call of conscience. Quote, the one, the they. German. Das Man, meaning they self. One of the most interesting and important concepts in Being and Time is that of Das Man, for which there is no exact English translation. Different translations and commentators use different conventions. It is often translated as the they, or people, or anyone, but is more accurately translated as one, as in, one should always arrive on time. Das Man derives from the impersonal singular pronoun man, one, as distinct from I, or you, or he, or she, or they. Both the German man and the English one are neutral or indeterminate in respect of gender and even, in a sense, of number, though both words suggest an unspecified, unspecifiable, Indeterminate plurality. The semantic role of the word man in German is nearly identical to that of the word one in English. Heidegger refers to this concept of the one in explaining inauthentic modes of existence, in which Dasein, instead of truly choosing to do something, does it only because that is what one does, or that is what people do. Thus, das Man is not a proper immeasurable entity, but rather an amorphous part of social reality that functions effectively in the manner that it does through this intangibility. Das Man constitutes a possibility of Dasein's being, and so das Man cannot be said to be any particular someone. Rather, the existence of the they is known to us through, for example, linguistic conventions and social norms. Heidegger states that the they prescribes one's state of mind, and determines what and how one sees. To give examples, when one makes an appeal to what is commonly known, one says one does not do such a thing. When one sits in a car, a bus, or reads a newspaper, one is participating in the world of the they. This is a feature of the they as it functions in society, an authority that has no particular source. In a non-moral sense, Heidegger contrasts the authentic self, my own self, with the they self, my unowned self. A related concept to this is that of the apophantic assertion, world, German, Welt. Heidegger gives us 4 ways of using the term world. 1. World is used as an ontological concept, and signifies the totality of things which can be present at hand within the world. 2. World functions as an ontological term, and signifies the being of those things we have just mentioned. And indeed, world can become a term for any realm which encompasses a multiplicity of entities. For instance, when one talks of the world of a mathematician, world signifies the realm of possible objects of mathematics. 3. World can be understood in another ontological sense, not, however, as those entities which Dasein essentially is not and which can be encountered within the world, but rather as the wherein a factical Dasein as such can be said to live. World has here a pre-ontological existential signification. Here again there are different possibilities. World may stand for the public, we world, or one's own closest, domestic environment. 4. Finally, world designates the ontologico-existential concept of worldhood. Weltheit. Worldhood itself may have as its modes whatever structural holds any special worlds may have at the time, but it embraces in itself the a priori character of worldhood in general. Note: it is the third definition that Heidegger normally uses. See also hermeneutics, existentialism, 20th century philosophy, continental philosophy. All citations referring to texts authored by Heidegger use H.X. to refer to the original page number. Dahlstrom, Daniel O. 7 February 2013. The Heidegger Dictionary. London. A&C Black. ISBN 978-1-847-06514-8. ISBN 1-847-06514-7. Monday. Roderick. March 2009. Glossary of Terms in Being and Time.